and welcome to those of you who have joined us this morning. It is 10 o'clock Pacific time, but I know we're going to have folks from all over the United States today. So good afternoon if it's afternoon your time, and if you're joining us at your lunchtime, feel free to eat. We were just talking about food, and yeah, definitely keep yourself nourished. So we're really glad that you all are here today for our first webinar of our Tribal Wellbeing Adaptation Miniseries. This is Getting Ahead of Climate Trauma. We have 2 more webinars in the series coming up in May and June, but today we have a featured guest speaker, Dr. Douglas Walker of the Mercy Family Center, who will be talking to us about how we can adapt and be on the front of these climate traumas instead of reacting to them after they happen. And with that, I want to pass it over to Angie Hacker to take us through some introductions.
All right. Hello, everyone. I want to really thank you for being with us today. And I want to talk to you about what we're going to do together. So this is, I want to talk to you about our purpose and what you're in store for. And hopefully you remain with us for the 3 sessions that we have planned in this mini series. And so the purpose of this mini series is to, we're working specifically with tribal serving professionals, and we're hoping to exchange strategies, knowledge, skills that tribal serving professionals can bring back to your community. So we're hoping to bring you some knowledge that is really applicable, something that you might take personally back home, but you also may take some strategies that you can build in your community. So we're hoping to help you protect well-being and adapt to growing stressors and trauma associated with climate change, build some skills to help you prepare, cope, and recover from traumatic climate events, ideally minimizing the need for formal mental health treatment, and in the process build generally mental, psychosocial, and spiritual resilience. And so the 3 sessions that we have planned for you, the first one is today that on the topic of what does climate stress and trauma look like to tribes. That's going to be followed up next month by another topic with other featured speakers. That topic will be Cascading Climate Disruptions, Collective Trauma, and Community-Based Approaches to Prevention and Healing. That will be with Bob Doppelt from the Resource Innovation Group. And the 3rd webinar in June will be on using the community resiliency model to enhance well-being. And that will feature folks from the Trauma Resource Institute. And so we have a lot of good information in store for you today and in the next couple of sessions. And I want to talk to you a little bit about today's agenda. And first, we're going to start with some introductions, and I'm going to do a little ground setting. I want you to hear a little bit more about the Tribal Climate Health Project and what led us into this area of knowledge. Why has this been interesting and important for us to share with tribal serving professionals like you all? While I'm doing that, I'd like to welcome you to introduce yourself over chat. There's a little panel on this screen that shows you where the chat box should be on your panel. And so if you could just take a moment to introduce yourself, just your name, organization, and location. And since we're here to talk about traumatic climate experiences, I just welcome you. It's an option. If you have something in mind, maybe you're here because you have had an experience, or you're just concerned that you will have one, or your community has faced something that has been a big climate event. Just briefly share, trapped during a flood, evacuated during a hurricane, that kind of thing. And Shasta and I will share a little bit about what we've experienced ourselves. So once we've done some ground setting, we will have a presentation by Dr. Douglas Walker of Mercy Family Center, who has helped us many a time trying to help bring some additional knowledge in this sort of emerging area of psychosocial resilience. We are really fortunate then too to have this be an interactive session. So we will have an opportunity to break out and have some discussion where you can process some of what we're we're talking about here today in terms of your own experience and your own lessons that you have learned. And we'll come back together, do a report back. We'll also have time for some Q&As. So there is actually a Q&A bar or Q&A button that you can press. So at any point in time you have a question, feel free to just throw it in the Q&A box. And then we'll just do a quick wrap up. So I want to introduce ourselves. So Shasta and I are the facilitators of this particular mini-series. We've facilitated a lot together over the years. So again, I'm Angie Hacker. I'm the CEO of Prosper Sustainably. We work with tribes and other communities all over the country, and super happy to continue to be here with Shasta and the Paula Band of Mission Indians. And I have worked with communities for over 20 years in the areas of sustainability, energy, climate change, and lots of time in the last 4 years working specifically with tribes on adaptation and from a specific angle of health and well-being. And I believe that climate changes lives, and to me this is a very personal issue, and my family has experienced lots of different climate events that have been definitely left an imprint on me. They were stressful, and probably the biggest one was a Category 5 hurricane approaching and being locked down for a series of days and preparing for that. And I will never forget the fear for my family. Okay, Shasta, on to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to see people joining us this morning and already sharing their experiences over in the chat. My name is Shasta Gaughan. I am the Environmental Director and also the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Paula Band of Mission Indians. And like Angie said, we've been working together for a long time now on developing these tools and trainings for folks to help them with their climate vulnerability and adaptation processes. But this piece about mental health has really become important. And I think just the number of people who are participating and reaching out to us about this shows that we're not the only ones that are finding how important this is. And for me, a lot of it came home to me last summer. And I grew up in San Diego, so I'm accustomed to this Mediterranean climate. And I'm accustomed to there being high heat days. I mean, that's not changed from my childhood. We had hot summer days. But last summer, I realized that I was finally going to have to back off of what my father had taught me, which was, we didn't used to have air conditioning and we don't need air conditioning now. You know, you open the windows at night and you put on a fan to suck out the hot air and you just take the heat. You know, that was very much my father's, still is my father's attitude. But at my little house in Escondido, I have a little weather station, because I'm a nerd. So I have a little weather station in my backyard. And during a prolonged heat wave, one day in my backyard, it got up to 119 degrees. And I live in a 101-year-old house that doesn't have air conditioning. Let me rephrase that. That didn't have air conditioning. I realized after that heat wave that it was not just about, sucking it up and dealing with the heat. It was about something that could potentially be life-threatening. For me, for my cats, for my chickens, I was worried about, I have a little flock of chickens, I was worried about them. And it occurred to me, this is not just about being able to handle what the weather throws out. This is about a change in the climate that is just going to keep making this worse. So lucky for me, that same dad who would yell at me about not using the air conditioning gave me the money to pay for central air in my house. So I guess he can suck it up, but when it comes to his daughter, he was very generous. I know not everybody can do that though. So even though my air conditioning kicked on a couple of days ago, because it was hot here in San Diego, I think a lot about the people who can't afford that and what's going to happen to them and what kind of stress and anxiety are they going through. So that's just one example, and I'm seeing a lot of you have some of your own examples. Please continue to put into the chat who you are, where you are, and if you are willing to share just a traumatic climate experience that you have had. All right, I'm going to throw it back to Angie.
Great. I just want to tell you a little bit more about this program that we've designed. So this is just one training on top of a series that we've done over several years now. So it actually all emanates from the Paula Band of Mission Indians. They're located in northern San Diego. That picture in the background is actually an aerial of their reservation lands. The Tribal Climate Health Project is federally funded. Paula Band Mission Indians Environmental Department is run by Shasta, and they're the ones that administer this program. They've hired Prosper Sustainably to help administer, and we have two kind of sets of programs that we run. One's through the Climate Ready Tribes program, which is really focused on Paula's adaptation, where we have built in health and well-being, including mental health and psychosocial resilience, into what they are doing on the ground within their tribe, and we do a lot of intertribal sharing around what we are learning. On the other side is the Tribal Climate Health Project, which is a capacity building program where we have developed resources, training, companion tools, and we are also doing a lot around data development. We have trained over 1,000 tribal serving professionals to date, and the research we have done incorporates a lot of the Western science, data, literature, but we compile that, we put that alongside of the knowledge that tribes have developed over time immemorial, but in particular the last several decades. None of these climate changes are taking tribes by surprise. They are aware of the changes that are happening in their ecosystems, and we want to acknowledge and integrate that into what we're training. One of the things we talk about with the Tribal Climate Health Project is the cascading effects of climate change. And so this is one of the frameworks that we use where we talk about the climate exposures, the primary climate exposures being around drought, storms and flooding, temperature extremes, wildfire, melting ice, and sea level rise that have a cascading effect on secondary exposures, including worsened air quality, vector changes, food insecurity, and water insecurity, and then impacts. So impacts is the purple there in the middle, and we talk about health impacts in 4 different ways: physical health, mental health, socioeconomic health, and cultural and spiritual health, and that's driven by the tribes that have been part of our advisory group. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. Is we're going to focus on sort of the right side, the mental health and cultural and spiritual health, which we think are integral parts of adaptation and often overlooked when we're talking about maybe the more visible parts of adaptation, which might look more like a levee or a culvert or something big, hard infrastructure projects. We want to focus on the things that are less visible, but potentially will lead to the greatest suffering. We have done a lot in the psychosocial resilience effort. In fact, Dr. Doug Walker has been part of a lot of that. We have developed our own psychosocial framework, psychosocial resilience framework for Paula. We've done trainings where we've incorporated this material, including a coping with crisis series. Shasta has been on the speaking circuit, being on presentations and podcasts, and even part of a publication, a health affairs publication. And we are currently now funded to do some research where we're tying together lessons learned that can be translated from COVID to climate change. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Doug in just a minute, but we're going to try to actually practice what we preach here. And we're about to take on a pretty heavy and scary topic. And while we're getting connected over there in the chat, that's a big part of what we're learning from the emerging literature is being connected in communities can greatly improve a community's ability to prepare, cope, and recover from these traumatic climate events. But we also want to be calm and centered. And so that's what the literature is telling us too, is that you can build resilience and recover faster if you have the skills to be calm and centered. So we're not going to dive too far into this. All I want to do is give us a minute to be silent. And I'm going to close my eyes and you can join me. If you have another practice, you're welcome to use it. But we're just going to take a minute to try to calm down any hyper arousal and get our biology in place so we can tackle this issue together. So if you can want to join me for 1 minute of silence. All right. You can join me in wiggling around and opening your eyes back up. I feel calmer, and we're so fortunate to welcome Dr. Doug Walker now, who's going to talk to us more about practices like that can really help us. So today's guest speaker is Dr. Douglas Walker. He's Chief Programs Director of Mercy Family Center. He's got decades of experience, including with tribes, working on the kinds of strategies we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Dr. Walker. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Angie, for the warm handoff. And let me find my screen here, and we'll launch PowerPoint. There we go. And so the question we're going to attempt to answer today is, what does climate stress and trauma look like to tribes? And I want to be kind of transparent, certainly up front, about where I come from, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But first, there's always thanks. And thanks today goes out to the Tribal Climate Health Project, the California Rural Indian Health Board, and the California Tribal Epidemiology Center for their support and backing of this talk. And so, regards to being transparent, I come from a place of diversity in the sense that I'm a Yankee. I was born and raised in Vermont, spent a lot of my schooling in upstate New York. But I've been living here in New Orleans for the past 26 years. My experience with regards to climate change is, like many of you, experiencing the episodic, or maybe not so episodic, more common events related to very acute events, which include hurricanes, wildfires, and flooding. And to that end, I come to you with experience not only as a father, as a husband, but also as a psychologist. And it was Hurricane Katrina here in New Orleans that got me into the business of mass trauma. I am a clinician devoted to individual work with individuals who have experienced traumatic events, and I'm a certified TF-CBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapist. But I also function on a larger scale, having helped communities in the past deal with and cope with events, both man-made and natural disasters. I'm on the SAMHSA's DTAC team, so when there's a federally declared disaster, I'm often asked to go and train. I've worked worldwide in helping communities respond to disasters, but I do want to point out some close relationships that I've had and continue to have. First is the United Homa Nation, and they're tucked in just below me here in southern Louisiana, and we've had a long relationship with Mercy Family Center, myself, in supporting their mental health and wellness programming down near the coast. A larger participatory work is with the Consortia for Administrators for Native Rehabilitation. And some of you on this call actually may have gone to some CANAR conferences, and I've contributed to there as far as the mental health and wellness related to voc rehab and the needs of individuals who are working very hard to get back into the workforce. And saying hello to my friends up north. I did a lot of work in the past in Alberta, particularly northern Alberta, in Fort McMurray, and helped produce a large-scale study on resilience, working with First Nations in the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo. So I just want to shout out to all those First Nations and tribes, and admit that, you know, I've certainly learned a lot. My expertise is in trauma, individual and mass, man-made and natural, but my everyday is devoted to these common mental health challenges that are really existing worldwide, acknowledging the fact that depression, anxiety, suicidal thinking, eating disorders, addiction, and finally trauma are really our kind of a big six that cost a lot in emotional wealth, if you want to call it that, and financial wealth as well. A lot of my work is with children, acknowledging the fact that many of these conditions occur before age 14. And before I forget, as we kind of bump along here, we're going to have time for questions. And so I can't see the chat right now, but if you want to hold on to your questions or throw them to Shasta one-on-one, she'll take them, and we'll certainly bring them up toward the end of our time today. I like to always think in the positive. And when we think of trauma, we have to first think of protective factors. We are not inherently born with coats of armor. I hear people often call children so resilient. Well, resiliency only occurs when there's a support around the individual. For children in particular, it's the relationships they keep and the structure that holds them in place, in a safe place. That's culture, that's community, it's school, it's family. And so protective factors, I always want to highlight first, and knowing that if we can manage these, we're doing much better off and have to work, not work as hard in managing our mental health, because we're kind of held or cradled within these kind of protective factors. As far as individual protective factors, we acknowledge that there are folks out there who just have a greater capacity for optimism. They're less negative. They're not the Eeyores of the world, right? They're more agreeable, this idea of flexible, and the belief that they can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We're still trying to understand if that can actually be taught or coached, or is it something just more inherent for individuals? Social connectedness, this is a big one for me. It's how we bear witness to each other and be with each other in community. We are gregarious. We are linked to each other. And there are other benefits that come with being connected, including shared knowledge, just support and activities, fun, understanding and acceptance, people that get you. That's hard to find sometimes. And then also normalizing, people being mirrors to our experience and saying, you know what, I'm feeling the same way too. So all those things are important with regards to social connectedness. When we think about social capital, we're moving into a little bit different space. There's a researcher out there, his name is Daniel Aldrich, and he's out of Purdue University. And he's really quantified this idea of sharing a cup of sugar. Like, what does it mean to be a neighbor, and why is that important? So social capital is knowing who your most vulnerable individuals are by neighbor, be able to disseminate information across the community. And I'm not saying email blasts, I'm talking about getting out in the street, walking down the street, and those micro conversations that we have in passing with each other that may sound like, hey, did you hear about, or did you know that? What do you know about? Those things, although hard to quantify, are so important in keeping people not only informed, but establishing this idea of safety and comfort, because they are informed and kind of know what the structure is around them as a community. Certainly being an advocate for outside and following disasters. So we want to be able to have meaningful discussions about accepting help from the outside. I say that having been invited to respond to disasters. That's one of my mottos. I believe that every response needs to be a local response, and that's why Paula developed their own model, because it was built around their beliefs, their culture, their terra, like where they live. And so I think it's important to know who your partners are, and be selective as well as you invite people into your space. Let's talk a little bit about definitions of trauma and types of trauma exposure. This is a big list, and I've added a few more. Certainly in our minds, especially today, and I should have had it highlighted, is racism. We can also acknowledge our past 12 to 14 months of experience around pandemics. This is the sad menu that we as trauma psychologists work with every single day. I do also want to highlight a relationship, kind of a newer, I guess, algorithm when it comes to man-made and natural disasters. I think we have someone here on the call from Austin. And so that reminds me, and I want to remind you all, that what we're seeing more and more of now is that natural disasters are causing man-made disasters. So in Texas, they had the grid blackout. And I think Jen's on the call who commented on her experience. But if we would look backwards, we can identify the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Fukushima, Japan, which began with earthquake, tsunami, and then nuclear meltdown of the Daiichi nuclear power plant. And then if you go back even farther, that's kind of how I got here. So Katrina wasn't so much the storm, it was the failure of the levees. And so we have to acknowledge that natural disasters can bring on man-made disasters, and we have to be prepared for that, that event. I also want to acknowledge on the call today historical trauma. And so it's the background, it's the space in between, if you want to call that. And so I want to be sensitive to individuals on this call and the tribes and nations represented, and acknowledge the fact that it's been generations of stress, horror, even helplessness across your nations and your communities. And it can vary from being, say, stressful on the left-hand side to even being traumatic. But cultural trauma, historical trauma, and this idea of intergenerational trauma has accumulated in your communities. And we have to acknowledge it first and foremost, that it is there. It's a constant, it's the space in between, and it can also take forefront. With regards to historical trauma, we want to certainly recognize the fact that we all come to this call today with histories. Our histories are born of our individual experience, but also our collective experience. And so in a lot of ways, we know that the past loss adds to personal, individual paths and journeys. It's added on, it's what's bearing on your shoulders even more than, say, the everyday. Intergenerational trauma is slightly different, but the same, in the sense that it does come from historical, but it's what we consider passed on by history and tradition. So there's a transmission that happens by storytelling, certainly, and by witnessing the remnants or the persistent racism in our country. So let's pivot for a second and look at ourselves. And this is where this talk kind of centers itself. Its core is understanding where individuals come from on that continuum, being our response as being exposed to stress or all the way up to the traumatic. Revisiting these here, again, all of them will have some degree of impact on individuals. The algorithm, the formula is difficult to determine based on who you are. My work with children is fascinating because of the developing brain. In fact, we don't use PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in describing a child's experience because there's a very clear developmental factor or factors that need to be acknowledged around development. Certainly a kindergartner and, say, a student in the 11th grade would experience the same traumatic event differently and certainly express that differently. In our work together, the therapy that I would engage in both of those individuals, those two age groups, would be different. I take a cognitive behavioral approach to trauma, acknowledging that trauma impacts our thoughts, our feelings, and our body, our physical reaction. And it's this cognitive behavioral approach that we find flexibility in changing the way that we perceive or accept or even acknowledge what happens to us. Because I am not, as a psychologist, I am not a cheerleader. I'm not here to cheer people up. If I was, I would wear a red nose and crazy hair and work on the feelings side, feelings corner. And that's nearly impossible to do unless you're a clown. Making people feel happy is not my job. My job is to help people change the way that they think in order to impact both feelings and in their body. Now that takes time. It's called cognitive behavioral therapy, but there are strong interconnections when we change the way that we perceive or even think about or change our narrative around what we've experienced. And so those are embedded in what we call evidence-based practices. It's one of the strongest models for addressing trauma. With regards to First Nations and tribes across the United States, there has been great work in really transposing the cognitive behavioral model into a circle that acknowledges, in addition, the spiritual. One good example of this comes by way of the University of Montana, I believe. They adapted, it's called Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in School. The acronym is CBITS. Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools. They were able to do some great research and adapt appropriately that original model into one that accepts and embraces the circle you see here. So let's talk about first acute stressors. Certainly any one of us who may be on the best coast, west coast, swimming, if you saw a fin in the water, we would acknowledge that your HPA axis would probably trigger, right? Our job is to survive, and our brain is the main organ in our bodies to do that. When it sees threat, it reacts. So there's flight, fight, or freeze. I don't think many of us would probably freeze in this situation, although I haven't been coached much on how to react when I see a fin in the water. But we have options. Our body usually is ready and ready to respond. In this sense, probably swimming as fast as you can. And so for acute stressors, we know that what you see here and what I've seen in the chat is that we are all experiencing acute stressors as represented by hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, snowstorms. Droughts are probably a little less acute, but to that end, there are acute stressors that happen that really drive our HPA axis, our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the fight, flight, or freeze. And we can feel that when we have news reports, when we see images of, when we have to evacuate our homes in a moment's notice because the wildfire direction has changed. And so we acknowledge that fight or flight or freeze. Chronic stressors, primarily as we are talking here in the form of climate change, are less understood. I've been doing background reading. We know that to some degree we're going to see an HPA response, that fight, flight, or freeze, but it's going to be at a lower level. And we're not going to see kind of the response in terms of being traumatized, but we're going to see it represented in more of a global or wider mental health field or palette or menu, if you want to say. To that end, these things are slow moving, very slow moving, like glacier. And there are new terms coming to describe this type of experience. This slow-moving, subacute experience that always keeps us on edge. So eco-anxiety, ecological grief, eco-guilt, eco-psychology are all terms that are being used and kind of thrown around in the common literature now to describe that in-between place of acknowledging that things are different. For Shasta, she's getting her AC. For others, you may have been threatened with a lot of change. In Louisiana, we have tribes who have been relocated. For others, you've acknowledged that your tribal elders, their experience now is coming up short in the sense that their knowledge of where wildlife is at certain times of the year, where the permafrost is, all those things are different and they just don't apply. We're kind of off we're off grid now, because that vital knowledge passed down from generation to generation to generation is not applicable. That in and of itself is stressful. Like, we don't have a roadmap for this. No one in our history has seen this change in wildlife migration, in the permafrost, in the water levels. So there's a lot to learn. It's new, but we have to be able to understand it as best we can in a holistic type of model. So this is an illustration that I think describes it in a simple way. There's concerns certainly around the medical and physical. So heat, exposure to different new types of pollen. We can have molds, the allergies. Kind of the physical part is always of concern. Mental stress, that's the piece that's hard to gauge, but we open it up beyond this idea of trauma to things like stress, anxiety, depression, grief, strains on social relationships, poor coping, like with substance abuse, and this concept, if it is dramatic or seriously traumatic, we could have post-traumatic stress disorder. As far as community health, it's the stickiness that keeps you all together. So it can break things down. Violence and crime, social instability. So to that end, I'm going to ask Shasta to assist us. I'd like to know from you all, after hearing kind of this kind of thumbnail picture of the impact of climate change on certain areas of your lives, our lives, what is your priority? So if you were to pick one of these, given what you know about your community, is it medical and physical that you're most concerned about with regards to climate change? Is it mental health? In other words, the stress, anxiety, maybe depression, or is it this idea of sense of community, this the stickiness, the things that bind you together, the threats that come with climate change? And so, Shasta, if you want to open up our first poll, we'll give people an opportunity to vote on 1, 2, or 3. There it is. So if you want to throw your vote in, we'll watch the percentage change here.
And just because I sometimes have to get my professor on when I do this stuff, I'll nag as I see people answering. We have 30 participants, but that's including your hosts. So that means 27 people who can vote. And actually we've had 20 out of 27 already vote. So those people who got up to get another cup of coffee or are just running this in the background while they do other things. Not that I would ever do that, and neither would any of you, I'm sure.
And I like what's coming through, because this is actually mirrors what you all are going to experience as you progress through this webinar series. So we've got 23 of 27. We have 85%.
So I'm going to end it because
if you want to share that with everyone, we can.
Yeah, I'll end it and then I will share the results. And also we had 4 people who chose other. So if you could put your answer for other in the chat, and I see that my friend Dorette has done that already. She says other, all of the above.
Okay, very good. So community health, and what is good about that response is you are in the right place. So Bob, in the next series, April, I think you guys are going to meet in May. He's going to talk about this idea of community resilience and so on, so in the 3rd series as well. I'm taking the more myopic approach in my talk. I'm talking about more about individual response, where Bob's going to open it up. This is where the most work needs to be done. And I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a second. I'm going to stop sharing if that's all right. There you go. Okay. So I think that self-care is important. And I think we've done a very good job, and we always arrive at plateaus and we learn more and we arrive at plateaus. And so the latest kind of trend and plateau is around, say, mindfulness, other types of spirituality, getting back to. I think that the coronavirus has reintroduced us to the need to certainly self-care. But I think that self-care can only go so far. And I think this idea of social capital and supporting each other is extremely important. And I believe in my heart of hearts that that's where the monies, the efforts need to be in making strong communities. Back to individual experience. I want to highlight here ACEs. And again, I can't see the chat box, but any of you who are familiar with ACEs, you can say yes, no ACEs, no ACEs. Well, it's been around for a while. It was born out of a coast on the West, a study on the West Coast, looking at adverse childhood experiences. I think Kaiser was one of the sponsors. There were a couple doctors who wanted to know what was early experience, what was the connection with early experience, in this case, physical abuse, psychological, sexual abuse, different types of neglect, on physical health. And so they were able to send out thousands of surveys, and it was in retrospect. They knew people's individuals' physical health and how healthy they were by way of weight and blood pressure and mental health issues. And they were going back in time to ask the question, what did you experience? What's interesting about this study is they also looked at environmental factors. And so the violence against mother, was someone in the home imprisoned, were there substance abusers present, mental illness, and separation or loss. And together, they looked at these ACEs and acknowledged the fact that for their group in the thousands, that 12.6% experienced 4 or more. Now they took this subgroup, this 4 or more, and compared them to individuals who had none. So 4 or more or none. And there was a dose response relationship. What I'm saying here is that as these things increased, as you got more ACEs, the chances of things like depression, heart disease rose dramatically. So there is a direct connection between adverse childhood experience and health. People die younger when exposed to 4 or more. Now, there's been recent research looking at protective factors. And if any of you want to email me individually, I can share those with you. For children, there are protective factors that can be placed or reinforced to help buffer these. And we're doing our best right now to understand and how to enhance these protective factors. So 12 times more chance for someone to take their lives by suicide after 4 or more ACEs. There is a separate literature for American Indian and Alaska Natives on the subject of ACEs. And so I'm going to hopefully be able to take you there. And so it's an information hub, and it is designed and presented by the National Indian Health Board. And it is more than I could cover today, but consider it a resource. At the end of my slide deck, which I'll also provide in a PDF, you'll find this and you'll find the site. So don't feel that you have to memorize it. But there's a lot going on here, and highly recommend that you take a look at it. So becoming trauma-informed. I like this topic because it's hot, right? So we went through lots of terms over the past decade, 2 decades, lots of terms that we use every day. So much so that I would say that things like terms like sustainable, organic, resilient have fallen to what we call semantic bleaching. We use them so much that they mean nothing. They're just fillers now. Sustainable, organic, resilient. So my I guess my lesson today is to call people out when they're using the term trauma-informed, because I'm going to tell you what it is, how to define it, how to develop it in your community. And when someone says, oh, we're trauma-informed, you're going to be able to call them. And I'm saying call them their bluff, but saying, you tell me in what ways are you trauma-informed? How have you operationalized the trauma or addressing trauma in your community? So back in the day, SAMHSA stepped forward and defined trauma-informed systems, I think very simply with just the 4 R's. So they realize, or we need to realize, the widespread impact of trauma that comes a lot with the ACEs study. It's ongoing research about how individuals and communities respond to acute and maybe more chronic events like climate change. We recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, so it's a little more fine-tuned. And then we're responding, right? Responding with accurate, timely, culturally sensitive policies, procedures, and practices. And in the end, we try not to re-trigger, right? That's part of it. Is we don't place kids in classrooms where they're going to be triggered. One story I tell here is of a young man that I treated in this very office. And sadly, his brother was killed in a car accident on the way to school. His brother was a senior. He was entering into the 9th grade, and then looking forward to sharing at least 1 year in high school together. This young man's first day back to school after his brother died, in English class, their assignment was focused on Edgar Allan Poe and death. So if we think about sensitivity and understanding how, in this case, individual education plans need to be tweaked or changed or adjusted, we need to do a better job. And so this young man did okay. We were able to get to the school and inform them of the changes they need to make. A path. So here is the opportunity to become trauma informed. What you're seeing here is an adaptation of really a manual devoted to schools. Schools, I think, and health systems are becoming the most trauma informed, but that's spreading. And I want to share here the path to becoming trauma informed. First, your community, your council needs to understand and acknowledge and have a buy-in at the highest level that there's some type of strategic plan to adopt trauma-informed systems. It is complex, but it's necessary to pull it all together to understand and acknowledge that there is, for your histories, a real there, as we say in the business, a there. So historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, current traumas, all mixed together. Next, what's happening right now today is professional development of staff. All staff need to be trained in what trauma is, what it isn't, the impact of trauma on individuals and communities. The slope gets steeper, and I've seen this primarily in schools, is that changing perspective, culture, and climate can be difficult. And we get to the steepest parts of this when we talk about shifts in policy and practice and really measuring change, right? Improved outcomes, measurements, right? So show me the beef. Where's the proof in this? So for schools, for instance, our measured outcomes should be improved grades, greater attendance, graduation rates, happiness, contentment within the school environment, feeling as though they're part of something bigger than themselves. Those are improved outcomes. A lot of organizations, be it school or healthcare systems, will get right to the point of policies and practice, but they don't measure outcomes. So it's important to really put your money where your mouth is, or in this case, measurement. So call people out. I give you permission to do that, saying, how is your community trauma informed? What does that look like? And hopefully they'll get to the point where not only have they changed their policy and practice, they're measuring outcomes. We're demonstrating an increased graduation rates for our high schoolers. That's an outcome, and that's a meaningful outcome. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the coronavirus and COVID-19. I'm a psychologist and I embrace metaphors. And I happened upon this about a year ago. And I thought, at least for me, helped me navigate the complexity of what coronavirus is and in COVID-19. It's a tilt-a-whirl ride. Many of you have ridden one. As for me, I'm not a person who likes to spin much, so I probably wouldn't ride this. But my point, if you look at this picture carefully, is first the sky. There is a storm. And that storm can be many things. It can be racism, it can be social injustice, it can be your own personal trauma. We acknowledge that there's always and can always be some type of storm. It could be intergenerational trauma, historical trauma. We step on this ride, which is the coronavirus, COVID-19, and we're all in it together. It's a universal experience. A pandemic is designed in such a way that there is no help coming. There's no outside entity to come in and offer help. We are all in this, and help is generally not coming. We're kind of on our own. As far as the cars, this could be your tribe, it could be your general community, it could be the organization in which you work, it could be your family. We ride it together as those things. But where we sit is important because our perspectives are going to be different. We get on this ride with our own histories, and where we sit, left or right of the person next to us, allows us to see the world differently. And I think this has been the path, and I think will be the future of our experience as we kind of pull out of COVID-19. We're all going to have experienced something different. Yes, the same ride, but where you sit on the car and how you spin and how you see things from where you sit will be different. So I want everyone to acknowledge that although it's the same, it's also different for the people that you care about and that you work alongside with. What we know, about the coronavirus and its impact on mental health is that in the future, the next 12 to 16 months, there's going to be a lot of pressure on mental health systems. The most vulnerable are going to be the most impacted. We know that from man-made and natural disasters, the smaller ones, is that vulnerable populations will be in the most need. We also know that most people are very resilient, that for the most part, 80% of us are going to do fairly well if given good support. I think that 80% is probably less, simply because we haven't had that strong social support that's necessary for good mental health and wellness. The forecast, as I call it, is for increased anxiety, depression. People ask about suicide. That is still undetermined. If we look way back, there's been some studies looking at the Great Depression. In the articles that I've read back then, there wasn't a sharp uptick in deaths by suicide, but we're being vigilant around that. Anxiety, depression. A recent survey by the American Psychological Association says that individual concern, what they're concerned about most or report most distress with, is weight gain. So that ties into things as well when we think about our whole selves, our health, our well-being. If we return to the stress to trauma continuum, we have to acknowledge that for all of us, being on that tilt-a-whirl ride is going to be different. And I wanted to gather from you all just a quick poll of where you're at. As we say down here in New Orleans, where are you at? And I want you to look at this simple scale, and we're going to poll you. It's anonymous. Poll you on this. Are you feeling like I've got this right now? Something's just not right. Would you say that things are difficult for you right now, or surviving this might be difficult as well? So I'm going to turn to Shasta again. We're going to open this up for the group and ask the question, which one of these best describes you right now? People are jumping into this.
Yeah, and I feel like we're all in the same place. And I just see that Althea Walker put in the chat that she's languished. I don't know if some of you saw, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday or the day before that talked about this space that isn't quite depression, but you're also not really happy, and it's being called languishing. And which I think is terrific. Unfortunately, New York Times has a paywall, so I don't know if you get free articles. I'm a subscriber, so I can share things. But thank you, Althea. I'm gonna share that in the chat. But yeah, we've got a lot of people answering this, and
Good.
I'll tell you
And
what,
I
I mean,
want,
we're not seeing any, I can't keep this up, and I can't answer because we're the poll administrators, but that would be what I would be picking is I can't keep
yeah,
this up.
yeah. So I had at least one of you out there said I can't survive this. I've just put in my chat function my email address, and I'd like to offer you up some confidential guidance on how to navigate this. Again, we can't ever expect that this ride is going to be the same for us on each day. And we all come to our call today with different experience, certainly with grief and loss. Including myself, I'm sure there's people here who's lost loved ones or have survived the COVID-19 with maybe persisting symptoms. So again, I just put my email address out there. It's Douglas W. Walker at yahoo.com. I'll show it again. So if you could please reach out to me if you're in any of those categories around I can't keep this up, or I can't survive this, free, confidential, just touching base, kind of that buddy system. And so please shoot me an email. So Shasta, if we want to continue.
Yeah, I will stop sharing. Okay.
We're approaching about a little over 30 minutes away from our endpoint here. And so we're going to wrap it up, my portion of this, and we're going to hand it back over to Angie and Shasta in a moment. So people ask me, so Doug, what do you think? What do you think's the future? So beyond this idea of depression, anxiety, what do you think is going to happen? Those of you on this call may know about this human experience that's, again, difficult to quantify. In New Orleans, and I've seen it in other types of disasters, there's a lot of certainly traumatic growth that can happen. And the popular literature right now is talking about all of us being able to experience and enter into this place where we're stronger. We're stronger for what's happened to us over the last 12 or 14 months. I think that's true. I think that can happen. But there's also a place of disillusionment, and it comes, and the only, or maybe the best way I can describe it is, after a hurricane or flooding, you've called the roof guy, you've called the sheetrock guy, the flooring. It's done, right? The house is back together. The paint is drying. Things physically are back together, but you're not feeling it. And I'm warning individuals that I think that for the coronavirus, many of us are going to arrive at a place where you're supposed to be, you should be feeling all right, that we're over this, we got this, we're moving on. A lot of people are not going to be there. There's going to be this emptiness. I'm not going to call it depression. I'm not going to call it anxiety, but certainly I used the word disillusionment. So I just, that's my own kind of crystal ball. And I'm talking with colleagues about it right now to somehow quantify it and address it in the future. So I'm gonna hand this over to Angie. Thanks for listening. We're gonna have time for questions at the end, but Angie's got some group work here for us today.
And actually, Shasta's going to lead us through a group discussion on this, but thank you so much, Doug, and stick with us, folks, because now we really want to hear from you.
Yeah, so I have to admit to having a little bit of a technical snafu, even though we rehearsed this on Monday. Apparently, I did not enable the breakout room function in Zoom. And even though I went and enabled it after we started, if you do it after you've already started your meeting, it doesn't give you the breakout rooms as an option until you relaunch. So rather than sending folks to breakout rooms, we are going to do an alternative where we're going to talk amongst ourselves. But I think several of you have used Menti before, where you can use that for polling and for live responses to questions. So if you haven't done Menti, I'm going to talk you through it right now. But first, I'm going to share my screen and start this. So what you want to do is open a new web tab, a new tab in your browser. And within that tab, just type in www.menti.com, and I'm going to put it into the chat here. And then you enter the code. So it's menti.com, which I just put in the chat. And then the code is 3854-0129. And then you should have a box where you are able to put in an answer to this question that we want to talk about. So I'll give it a second while people get their way over to Menti. And one thing that I'll say that bothers me a little bit about Zoom is that you can't just put in a www and it turns into a link. You have to actually put the HTTP in there for it to linkify. So that link is in the chat now. The thing is that this was the question we wanted to ask in breakouts, so that there would be, since there's 30 of you or 30 of us, there would have been maybe 5 or 6 people in each room to actually be able to have a discussion about this. But instead, I'm hoping that you can think about your answers. And here we have one that just popped up, and start to put those into Menti. And then we'll give people a little bit of time to do this. And in the meanwhile, I will read some of them out. But I'm liking what I see so far. Go ahead, Angie.
Oh, I just want to encourage people, if you're comfortable, you can share your webcam to make this a little bit more like a discussion. And feel free to, you can share your responses in Menti, but this is also a good time if you want to share out loud, share a thought. Please do. You can unmute yourself. You can go ahead and add to the conversation. It can be on this prompt, but if you're prompted to share something else that came to you as a result of the presentation we just had, please share.
And I already like what we're seeing here. A couple of different things about virtual communication. Oh, I just realized if I click on one of the scrolling things, it'll highlight it on the screen. I don't know if you can all do that or if that's my superpower. Oh, no, this is a good one. Not all tribes have the same abilities to shift online. That's true. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been on plenty of Zooms or online where the person has to turn off their camera. I don't know. I mean, we could have another poll. This would be kind of fun. How many of you have frozen on Zoom and had a colleague send you a screenshot of your face in some sort of gargoyle snarl because you're like, and that's where it stops. So let's see. Continue to foster relationships with all that lives. Educate others how personal impacts. Oop, I can't see this because the chat's in my way. Yeah, how personal impacts are planetary. Here's a good one. Realize the importance of staying connected. So virtual tools have become very important. Let's see, what else do we have here?
And like social connectedness is so important, including physical. So, and I really have to say, Dr. Walker has drilled this in for us, and in future conversations in this webinar series, I think we're going to talk more about how do you do that? How do you make that happen within a community? I think that's the challenge. We might know connection is important, but how do we build it?
Yeah, a lot of people are talking about their bandwidth issues, and also coordination. And this is, I don't want to say that there's good to have come from the pandemic, but if we've learned something from it, then at least out of a bad situation, we've been able to create some important conclusions. I love this. Relationship building is most important to disaster response. Oh, and that technology and the internet are a basic, what did that say? Basic human rights need. To be flexible and adaptable. So it looks like we've got a lot of the responses have come in. So thank you so much for sharing on this. I'm gonna leave this up in my background so we could come back. Ooh, that thing about elders being left alone or without preparation. Yeah, that's super important. But we can come back to this, but right now I'm gonna stop sharing and bring it back to to our screens. So, and again, those of you who are willing to let us see your beautiful faces, that would be great. If you don't want to be live, that's okay too. And I'm gonna ask if anybody is willing to actually talk to us about some of what they said. So I don't know who said what, but anybody who was talking about internet connection and bandwidth, if you're willing to expand on your experience a little bit and how that applies to our climate work, I would love to hear from you. And I just saw Lorena just turned herself on, so I don't know if that means you want to talk.
Thank you, first of all, for the invite to participate. I think this is a very important topic. I'm the one that stressed the importance of communication. I know many of us have said it, but I think finding the tools, and the tools at work obviously is very important. I personally work for an agency, actually PA, that has a lot of, that communicates with a lot of stakeholders. And I found that it's been so important, not only to provide or work with the tools that are available, but also dive more into the way we're using the tools to communicate. It's not just about going through an agenda and providing, you know, some kind of summary, but it's really more about understanding what people that are participating, what they're saying, and what they're raising to me as a representative of an agency. And I personally haven't used a lot of these tools with my family members. I think I do more of the phone and more of the, you know, one-on-one connection. But I have to say that very, very important that the tribal communities, as well as other stakeholders that I work with in the border region, for me, is very, very important, has become vital during this time during this period. So thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. Is there anyone else who wants to talk about connection issues and how that's been so problematic for you, not just during the pandemic, but during disaster in general? I'm looking at names and seeing if there's anybody I can pick on.
I will say, you know, while people are thinking about it, this has come up in a lot. There's been congressional hearings and different summits and things around how to better serve tribes as a result of the pandemic, but other disasters too. Broadband has been a big topic, and I think the federal government is looking to address. And I think all the time about a lot of the tribes I work with in California, it may be a wildfire, it may be a heat event, but power outages are occurring more and more. And so we'll find ourselves without the ability to stay connected, even as in-person becomes, you know, remains not as much of an option as we'd like.
I see that my friend Lisa Gober, you said you need to say what your tribe learned and what you learned are very different. I would love to hear you expand on that.
Thanks, Shasta. I don't really want to expand on that. And I know you'll excuse me because you hear me talk blah, blah, blah all day long on all kinds of other calls. So what I've learned is very personal and interpersonal and that kind of thing. And what the tribe learned is well, different ways of doing business. And, you know, I think that's good. And that's all I can add. Thanks for asking.
No, I understand. And I think a lot of us are in that same position. But in terms of being able to apply these lessons, it's hard to look at trauma and say, well, what can I learn so that the next time I'm traumatized, I'm better able to react. For Althea, for some reason, your face is telling me that you want to say something.
I was just agreeing with what you were saying. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, and just to share, you know, my perspective, especially with the organizations I'm affiliated with and work for, you know, I feel they've been especially in regards to like my own mental health and well-being, my family, taking care of ourselves, being provided mental health days on Fridays, and my organization covering that. And just, making sure to ask about me and, my family, how are we doing before we even start talking business. And that, I mentioned earlier about relationship building, and that, I feel like that has been instrumental in, getting through this time and the work that we have to do in respect to climate adaptation. Just, giving a shout out to the organizations that I work with, that they put our well-being before the things that we need to take care of in respect to work.
Thanks, Althea. And I thought I saw somebody else kind of raise their hand. Was that you, Jen? Yeah, go for it.
Hi there, everyone. I wanted to just kind of share something that we've been learning in my community that isn't a learning from a tribal community, but is universally applicable. I had posted at the beginning that kind of the most recent climate-related trauma that I've lived through was the big winter storm that we had statewide in Texas, that took out our power grid for almost a week, not hours, not days, but measuring in weeks, and then the cascading effects of losing water, losing food, losing communication, people dying. And so I think one of the big things that's starting to emerge from that connects our over-reliance on digital communications and that important thing, Althea, that you were just mentioning around the value of relationships, is that so much of the communication was digital. And of that digital communication, it was predominantly going out through social media channels, which in normal times, you're only getting a fraction of the people, but in abnormal times, when not everybody has access to internet connectivity or a charged phone or anything like that, it fails on a wide scale. And so I'm a member of Buy Nothing Project, which is a Facebook group that allows kind of localized sharing. You can ask for anything you want and you can give anything you want, but no financial transactions are allowed. And that already in non-disaster related times was already a great connectivity tool, and like forming offline relationships and getting to know your neighbors that you otherwise wouldn't talk to because we live behind closed doors and closed garage doors and whatever else. But in the event, I mean, it was people's lifeline. Like I literally saved a neighbor's life during that event because of that group. And one of the things that came out of that was that we're now creating a contact tree that isn't solely dependent on Facebook or any other social media platform or even phone, but so that we have a tiered connectivity tree of I'm responsible for contacting this person, they're responsible for contacting this person, and that may be phone and that may be email, but it may just be going over to their house, getting there any way you can. So really trying to bridge that digital divide.
That's fabulous, Jen. And I will say that based on my personal experience as an Anglo person, European descent, one thing I've learned just in general from tribes is that being a member of a tribe means that you are born into a contact tree. And so, and I see, not everybody's got their camera on, but I see Althea nodding emphatically on that. And that can go two ways. That goes the way of, let's check on our elders, let's check on our vulnerable populations, let's make sure everybody is healthy. It also means that everybody's nose is always in your business, whether you need it to be or not. And I've learned that happens because I've been in Paula for so long that I end up being a part of that. But I also live alone. And my fear is that my cats are going to eat me before, when something happens to me, before anybody finds me. So I should probably make sure that somebody knows to come and check on me. Lori, you have your eyes open. Lori, you have your hand up.
I know it's rare for me to have my eyes open. So ironically, I just got the message that my internet connection is unstable. But as a state worker, I wanted to share that this pandemic has really shown me that we need to be more patient and give people different ways to communicate. We were working with a member from a very small tribe in the Eastern Sierra who didn't use cell phones or email. And so to get her invited to a meeting, we needed to either send her a snail mail letter or find somebody in a neighboring tribe that would go over and give her the message. So that eliminated the possibility of Zoom or changing meetings at the last minute or anything else. And it really required some patience and compassion.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. Is there anyone else who wants to share? And it doesn't actually even have to be a good thing that you learn that you can use. It can also be things you learn that weren't working, or that you found failed you. And just along those lines, I feel like a lot of the stuff we talk about in terms of being able to support people has been harder in COVID because we can't touch people. And there's so much power in touch. In general, I'm a person who I'm not a touchy-feely person, but even I, after all this time, just want to hug my friends. So that's been hard. I hope that we don't have to continue to apply that when in our climate trauma response. I think there's a lot that we gain just from being able to physically comfort one another. So I don't know if any of you have come up with alternatives to that, but strangely enough, I don't know if I'm activating some weird neurological thing, but even if I do this, like the virtual hug, it's like gets me a little bit of the feeling of like, oh, I'm hugging all of you. That sounded a little bit aggressive. I'm sorry.
Hey,
Angie, go
Shasta,
ahead.
I was thinking too about I'm thinking about you and supporting you as the pandemic hit and watching your role change, because nobody in any community, and maybe particularly tribes, was ready to have all the systems in place to protect people as this came down. And I feel like a lot of people probably are thinking we wish we had some things up front. We know some things now that would have been useful then. So I'm interested in what, how folks' roles changed, and particularly on these systems that you were working on up front that were around communication. There was so much false information floating around. It was really difficult to get the right information out. It was unclear who should disseminate it, how to disseminate it, and so I just thought you might want to drill in on that, and maybe others have some shared experiences around that too.
And I would love to hear from one of our male participants. Like one observation I make is that it seems like when it comes to climate work, it's majority women. So I want to hear it from a man. And I could just, I'm making assumptions here based on photos and names. So, in terms of gender. Nope, nobody wants to volunteer.
I can share an example. It's not a personal one of mine, but one of my good colleagues from the Climate Science Alliance in Southern California. And you asked about just role changing, and you're doing this on a regular basis, but now it's a pandemic. What do you do? And because of built relationship and the connections that the CSA had with the tribes in Southern California, and having those lines of communication, that they were able to help distribute supplies and PPE, and I hear them share that example often of the importance of relationship building and responding to any type of disaster, and that's the example that came to mind when you brought that up, Angie.
Yeah, thank you, Althea. And I think Doug brings up a good point here in the chat, and I wonder if he wants to expand on that a little bit. So we've talked about that. You made a big impact on me early on when I interviewed you, that the best thing we could do to prepare is to get to know each other. but
Yeah.
and maybe tribes have an advantage here, but there might still be a little work to do.
I laugh when we become so advanced. We just flew a helicopter on Mars, but we don't know our neighbor's name. And looking at different types of disaster, so I think someone on the call mentioned that living in isolation, living in especially high, I think of New York City after Hurricane Sandy, we had difficulty in creating community connectivity because no one knew each other because of the stacking involved with multiple floors. I would love to see our preparedness around wildfires, hurricanes, as robust as what we in our area what we call night out against crime. So there's a time of the year that the police departments get together and they sponsor where everyone comes out and meets each other and talks about public safety. I think here in Louisiana, I don't know where I'm going to get footage or a foothold on this, but I think that officially it's June 1st. They actually may expand it. Imagine that. It may start earlier. So June 1st, I think we should get together as neighbors with block parties and get to know each other by first name, basic needs. I mean, you don't need much other than to know who to go to. I remember way back in Katrina, we had lost power for 4 or 5 days. So that was the only way, was to go around and see who was around and knock on doors. That's where I think we're headed. The more we get technologically savvy, and I put it in here too. Yes, I think that web access, internet, Wi-Fi is almost a basic human right now. And so to that end, we also need to balance that with that connectivity and knowing who your neighbor is. Maybe the pendulum will swing, since we've been denied that with COVID-19, that we'll be more intimate with each other in a healthy way as neighbors. So yeah, I hope in 3 or 4 years we can be really excited about these types of initiatives like Jen and Austin has highlighted.
Yeah.
If it's okay, I'm going to share some of the questions that have been asked that haven't maybe yet been answered, and make sure we have a little time for it. Lola had asked earlier on if we can provide a link to the ACEs studies. So Doug, I don't know if you have that handy, but we could always send it out afterwards.
I don't. You can find it. I'm going to do a PDF of my whole talk. On the back is resources and references, so it'll be in there.
Yes, perfect. And we'll send that out as a follow-up to this meeting along with the recording of it, so you have it handy. Lori had also asked a question. These climate changes are here quick, and CBT, I'm not sure what that acronym is, takes time. What are some things we can do?
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
Oh, okay. What are some things we can do to scaffold people now, or should we give up on a quick mental fix?
Well, I'll take that on. A quick mental fix. Our job is that no one ever arrives at the level of having to do CBT. If we do self-care, if we do community care, along with supporting this idea of resilience, that's the way to go. I reserve and I try to avoid talking about formal mental health because I don't want people to end up going there. Now, certainly there's a predisposition. People come with honest genetics around anxiety, depression. There are skill sets, and actually the Paula document highlights a program, an intervention that I've been highlighting for COVID-19 called Skills for Psychological Recovery, SPR, and it's skill building. It's about problem solving. It's about managing emotions. It's about social connectedness, helpful thinking, positive activities. And so I'm going to put it in the chat here. You're welcome to look it up. I've trained in this. I've done kind of overviews on behalf of Paula and this webinar series in the past, but I'll drop it in here. So the short answer is skills, not mental health therapy, skill building.
And I will definitely share the previous trainings that we have done on this topic as well, if people want to take a look at those when we follow up on this event. I want to give time for anybody else who has questions to go ahead and ask them before we close out.
I see that Lola turned on her camera, so maybe that means you have a question, Lola?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for responding to the questions that I had and stuff. You know, it's helpful to know where you can get the tools and resources that, you know, you need to kind of navigate through what's going on and stuff. So I really am very appreciative of that. So that's all, you know, I wanted to make sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love seeing people's faces.
Yeah.
So hi. There's my pal Lisa. Yay. Are you still in Albuquerque, Lisa? No, she's like, I'm muted, Shasta. Don't ask me questions.
I am still in Albuquerque. And if while we have this group on the call, I did want to mention something that keeps coming up in my mind listening to the COVID pandemic stuff. And the one of the things that I keep hearing the scientists, the doctors, the knowledgeable say about the reason Indian tribes were or Indian people were hit so hard was because of our tendency to live in have lots of people in our house. And then I listened to Doug say, we really need to get to know the people around us. And I'm thinking, you know, what I did, my survival technique was to say, Chairman, I need to go be by my family. And you know what? He, after jumping through some hoops and doing the kinds of administrative stuff that I need to do, create a policy, blah, 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 all that crap. He and the council decided that I had made the case that I should be able to work from remote. But what I knew in my heart was I needed to be by my family because we didn't know what was going on. I did know that I had friends dying in Mexico and Arizona, and so I did what I could for myself. And luckily, I work for a tribe that says, you know what, we want you to stick around with us too for a bit. So why don't you go do what you need to do? Keep working with us. And what my point is, what we know in our Indian homes, in our Indian communities, is that we need each other, and that it shouldn't be considered a detriment for us the way we live with our families, multi-generational and lots of people in the house, because it keeps us connected to each other. And you know, and besides that, we tend to have less economic resources, and it's a necessity. And I'm going to turn off my video just because I tend to lose you guys.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm just glad that for me, somebody who has grown up in a culture that doesn't necessarily prioritize going beyond your immediate family, I do think that not just COVID, but climate has taught me. And I'm glad that I've made so many friends like you, Lisa, and Althea, and so many others that I know were even remotely. We've created community amongst ourselves, and I get hope from that alone, knowing that we're all in this together. So I see Angie's brought up our closing slide, because we, you know, as they say, we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So Angie, I'm going to go ahead and let you close us out.
So I want to thank you for participating in this. And, you know, as you'll see in the next couple of webinars as well, this is going to be a mix of sharing literature, research, emerging best practices and models, but it only really is valuable when we can integrate that with the experiences that you're having, and we can share knowledge between each other. So thank you for bringing that with us. I do think in the next couple of webinars, you're going to see some strategies that you can really consider implementing individually and within your community as well. And so, you know, what we talked about practices to, something called purposing, presencing, speakers will talk about how to get into the resilience space. So there's all these techniques, but some of them have been applied in tribal communities. Tribes have their own way of doing that as well, and we want to make sure that those are featured in these conversations. So be thinking about that, and we do hope that you join us next time. Next time will be May 19th, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, or 1 p.m. on the East Coast. And again, it will feature Bob Doppelt from the Resource Innovation Group, and he's wrote a book. He's a big leader in something he calls transformational resilience. So please stick with us for that. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
And thanks
everybody.
again to Dr. Walker. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.